evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions tonight. Foreign editor for The Australian, Greg Sheridan. Shadow Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus. New Yorker correspondent and Trump watcher, Susan Glasser, who's in Australia to deliver the Lowy Media Lecture. Chief political correspondent for the Saturday paper, Karen Middleton. And Special Minister of State, Alex Hawke. Please welcome our panel. Thank you very much. Q&A is live in Eastern Australia on ABC TV, iView and News Radio. Well, tonight we're hoping to get to APEC, Jerusalem and religious freedom. But our first question comes from Craig Tobler. Go ahead, Craig.
This morning, Bill Shorten tweeted, "I've written to Scott Morrison proposing a bipartisan task force to establish a National Integrity Commission. This should be above politics. Does the Coalition still believe it has the numbers to stop the inevitable creation of a National Integrity Commission?"
Alex Hawke.
Well, thanks for the question. It's not so much about stopping it, it's about getting it right and making sure that any proposal actually will do better at finding corruption and dealing with it at the federal level. We've had a mixed experience in the states. I think we've seen some different results of state independent commissions against corruption. Certainly in New South Wales, there's been a lot of lessons about the way the legislation's been framed, about the way people's reputations have been handled. And if you look at the state experience, it isn't obvious that one body at the federal level is the best way to tackle corruption when you're dealing with national security, when you're dealing with foreign affairs, when you're dealing with a much broader range of government than you are at a state level. So there's a lot to consider there. But you say Bill Shorten sent a tweet, that's true. But, you know, the media had this information before the Prime Minister had the information. So, you know, if it's bipartisan...
I presume the Prime Minister got the information eventually. So
well, eventually.
Does he think that a bipartisan agreement with Labor to produce a National Integrity Commission is a possibility?
Well, it wasn't a good start that the media got it before he did if it was bipartisan. But I'll say this, I think the government's open-minded about this question. You know, we'll look at the best way to deal with corruption at the federal level, but the federal government is very broad and it's not obvious, and it wasn't the Labor Party's view for a long time, that one body would be better than all the different agencies that we do have already working across the federal government to deal with corruption.
You've probably seen Labor's model, which, unlike the ICAC in New South Wales and other similar bodies, has private hearings, at least initially and in most cases. Would that get around the kind of problems that you were talking about?
Well, these are the essential questions, and Labor's had a year to deal with this, but we haven't seen the model yet. We haven't had time to look at it, and frankly, they haven't answered those essential questions.
Well, so, Mark Dreyfus is here.
You know, Mark didn't always support
some of those essential questions now.
I think the answer to your very good question, Craig, is the government has got no idea. And you've just heard it there from Alex. This morning, Christopher Pyne rejected the idea. We've been asking the government since Bill Shorten, at his press club speech on the 30th of January, invited the government to work with us on a bipartisan basis to get this done. And we think time's up, which is why Bill's written again. And I held a press conference with him this morning to again renew the invitation. We think that this is best done on a bipartisan basis. We think there has been a loss of confidence and trust in our system of government. We think this is one way, not the only way, but one way in which we can go some distance towards restoring trust and confidence. And
why does it restore trust and confidence to have a body if there's no real evidence of corruption?
Oh, I'd be very pleased if it found no corruption. But regrettably, not that I'm saying that there's a massive level of corruption in Australian government, I don't think there is, but I don't think there's none either.
OK, very quickly, you better tell us what it is you're proposing, because as I understand it, it's a standing Royal Commission, effectively, with the powers of a Royal Commission, that is the powers to subpoena evidence, to start investigations, and to compel witnesses, but privately. Is that correct?
No, all of those elements.
Behind closed doors.
All of those elements, but the Commission would have the discretion to conduct hearings in public. And we have the advantage that almost every state and territory already has such an anti-corruption body, and we're able to learn from the mistakes and some of the benefits that have been learned through those, in some cases, say the New South Wales ICAC for over 30 years. We think the time's up. We think that the Australian people want this to happen. We're saying to the government, work with us to create this on a bipartisan basis, and we could actually do this before the next election if the government were to be willing to work with us. It is something that has to involve government, though. There's a need to consult with existing agencies. There's a need to do the detailed design. We've made from government, we've made that clear all along. but we've repeatedly made this call through the year. It's very hard to tell what the government's position is. Alex didn't make it any clearer. Christopher Pyne rejected it this morning. We've heard nothing from Mr Morrison. And although the ABC did us a favour last week by revealing that apparently Mr Turnbull, the former Prime Minister, and Mr Porter, the Attorney-General, had been working on something. But my guess is that Mr Morrison doesn't want to do it.
Greg Sheridan.
Well, look, Tony, never having myself ever been involved in corruption or indeed tempted to act corruptly, it's not a matter which has been at the forefront of my mind. But I must say I've become increasingly dubious about star chambers and what they produce. I think the special prosecutor experience in America is an object lesson in what not to do. It's really a disaster. It always ends up charging people with process offences. The ICAC experience in New South Wales, where we've lost premiers who by no stretch of the imagination are corrupt, Nick Greiner and Barry O'Farrell. You know, there's a wonderful line in Tony Blair's memoirs where he says, any human action, if subject to a distorting microscope, can look strange and sinister. And we've got all kinds of agencies that supervise ASIO and the intelligence agencies and so on. You're going to get a lot of duplication out of here. You're going to get a lot of grandstanding. It's probably inevitable because that's the time we live in, but I think it's going to be a bad development.
Karen Middleton.
If we did have a body like this, I would hope that it would be preventative, so that insofar as there is corruption now, there would be less, just for the fact of having a body that existed with the standing powers of a Royal Commission. And it would create extra transparency, I would hope. I mean, there are still parts of our system that are not as transparent as they should be. For example, the area of political donations. The reporting process is cumbersome. There's a great delay in reporting domestic political donations. We can't match up donations with the actions of a government to tell whether in fact anything was done in return for a donation. The donor can withdraw or can amend the donor information later. And we've still got a system where there's a lot of reliance on corporate donations. In fact, the big political parties take a lot of corporate donations. I believe there's an event tomorrow in Sydney for the Liberal Party fundraiser for corporate donors, sort of speed dating. I think it's called a business encounter or something. They pay about 12 grand and they get to sit down with ministers, each of the big corporate donors to the Liberal Party. But
you're not suggesting that's corruption?
No, I'm not. But what I'm saying is the donations are there. The Labor Party does it too. They had one of these earlier in the year. I don't think they charge as much, but maybe the price goes up in government.
Close.
I don't know. And then they're having another one at the end of the year in conjunction with their national conference. But the point is, there are corporate donations that are made. It's hard to track them. There's a delay in reporting them, and then it's a bit hard to match them up with what the government has done in the meantime.
Alex, do you want to make a quick response to that? I mean, $12,000 a head. I can't remember what Karen said. Speed dating arrangements with corporate donors.
Yes,
it doesn't look good to a lot of people, I suppose.
Sure,
but is it worthy of examination by the Integrity Commission?
No, well, obviously not. We have a political donations regime, and transparency is required. It's unlawful if it's not declared and disclosed under the threshold, over the threshold. And look, I'm going tomorrow, so I hope it isn't speed dating. I really do. But it's fairly standard practice. What is important, as you say, Karen, is that it is transparently disclosed and that it is a proper lawful regime. And look, they're all fair points.
Just a quick one. You heard Mr Dreyfus talking about the Labor's model. Any chance at all, in your mind, your personal preference, would it be for bipartisanship to actually see something like this happen before the next election? Well,
look, not on what Mark Dreyfus has said there. There's nothing in there that convinces me. I mean, Greg Sheridan makes a good point about the state corruption commissions. If I make this point, they've got a terrible record of convictions for corruption. They have a really, really low conviction rate. And if you're suggesting that we've had all these state corruption bodies with all these powers, they've ruined a lot of people's reputations, they've pursued a lot of niche matters, but we haven't got into the heart of serious corruption matters at state government level, we have to do a lot more work on a model or a lot more work on something. And what Mark said was the government should be doing the detail on it. Well, we are already working with our agencies. We think a multifaceted approach is better than a single agency. And I think if you put one agency across the whole federal government, you'll have the same problem that you do at state level, where it has a lot of power, but you're not getting any convictions for corruption. You're not getting any actual outcome.
I've got to say, Tony, I find it staggering that Alex Hawke, who lives in New South Wales, could possibly say that the New South Wales ICAC has not got into the heart of serious corruption. And everyone here who lives in Sydney knows exactly what I'm talking about. I do not need
Well, what are you
to
talking about, Mark? Is that
I'm talking about a whole
Judge
range of
Labor Party.
convictions. I'm talking about a whole range of convictions of people who served as ministers in the government of the state of New South Wales.
Yeah, I understand.
Well, if you can be as partisan as you like, but
I'm
it's
just
actual
factual,
corruption,
not being partisan.
and it's a staggering thing for you to have said that the New South Wales ICAC did not get to the part of serious
Can I just put a very
decade
quick question
to
to
get to
you
that.
as a lawyer and a potential Attorney General? Does it disturb you at all that people have been named as being corrupt but not charged, that they've never seen a trial, that they have no way of redeeming their reputation?
Well, there are means by which you can challenge, but I think it's far more important that there be a system where people can make complaints, bring forward their allegations and know that they will be investigated, so that we can't have things swept under the carpet, that you know that there is some means. At the moment there is none. And there's some limited integrity bodies at the federal level, and of course in any system you're going to find results that you will point to that you say that's an unjust result or I don't like that outcome. Right. But in the broad, it's really important that there be a means of investigating systemic and serious corruption. That's what a national.
So do they have
Integrity
such a
Commission
thing as a
would be.
National Integrity Commission in the United States?
Well, first of all, I'm so delighted to be here and to see that America's not the only country with partisan politics these days. You know, the United States, we do have a variety of different laws and regulations and bodies at the federal level, many of which were born in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal. So it's an interesting response to an overwhelming political scandal. And so you had a whole set of new laws and regulations that created something called the Office of Government Ethics, which is kind of the closest, I think, to what you're talking about. Interestingly, the director of that office got in a big fight with President Trump very early on in his tenure and actually quit in protest because I think one thing we're finding in the United States in particular with this executive branch that has come in under President Trump is that you can have rules but if you challenge the norms, much of this behavior falls outside of the realm of that which is regulated. So in other words, you know, we've had, for example, a long tradition of presidential candidates in both parties releasing their federal tax returns. President Trump, as you know, refused to do that in the U.S. campaign, and even when he became president, he did not do so. That's not enshrined in any law. That's not really covered by this Office of Government Ethics, and yet it is probably one of the biggest norms in terms of transparency that's been violated as a result, and there's really no recourse.
Yeah, we'll move on because we've got a lot of Trump questions to come back to. The next question is from Greg Pittman.
Yes, thank you, Tony. My question is to Karen Middleton. Your recent revelations about Scott Morrison's history and conduct as Managing Director of Tourism Australia raises questions about his competence. Do you think this will be a factor for voters in the next federal election?
Karen, for those who don't know of your reporting, you better at least outline what it states.
Yeah, so there was an audit report that was kind of hiding in plain sight that was dated back to 2008. The Auditor General did an investigation into Tourism Australia and in particular 3 large contracts that the tourism body had dealt with, and it made some criticisms of the way that those contracts were dealt with, 2 of them in particular. Weirdly, the contracts themselves are don't appear now to be on AusTender, which is the website that records all of these contracts. They seem to have disappeared, even though the original documents that foreshadowed the contracts were there. So it made some criticisms of the agency itself, and that the period in question was when Mr Morrison was Managing Director of Tourism Australia.
You should point out that the audit report does not name Scott Morrison personally.
No, and in fact it only mentions the Managing Director insofar as the Managing Director is on the board of the agency. But it was his stewardship period that was in question, and it was very critical of the way this was all handled. And this was a report that was published 2 years after he was dismissed from Tourism Australia in I think July of 2006, and the report indicates that things kind of came to a head between the agency and the federal government over the handling of these contracts in that month, and he was then dismissed. And this audit was conducted after that and was published in 2008, but wasn't further scrutinised because the audit Auditor General does a whole stack of these reports every year, and I think there were 40 of them in that year. The Public Accounts Committee in Parliament has the job of scrutinising these and making a choice about which ones it looks further at, and it didn't choose this one, so it just sat on a shelf.
How serious were the governance breaches?
Well, the suggestion was there were breaches of procurement guidelines. There was a failure to report, pardon me, to the board of an underspend of $3.9 million on one contract. There was some strange documentation and accounting issues involving a motorcycle for the American Chopper TV series. A whole lot of things that just weren't really done according to the way they should have been done. There were criticisms made of the board as well in the period after Mr Morrison left. There were questions about conflict of interest, which didn't relate to him, that related to that subsequent period, and changes had to be made to the board too. So the whole agency was criticised, but the particular target was these contracts in that
Were you
period.
able to establish whether, as a result of his handling as CEO of these contracts, he was sacked? Because he was ultimately sacked by a Liberal government minister.
I've been told that there were concerns about a number of things. This report talks about the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet intervening to conduct an audit or order an audit of its own because of its concerns. I've been told that this was when things actually came to a head and that this was the reason, ultimately, the tipping point that he lost his job.
Alex Hawke, does the public actually have a right to know why Scott Morrison, now Prime Minister, was sacked as the leader of a government-funded organisation?
Yeah, well, Tony, there's a few points to make about this, and you know, Karen is right. It wasn't hiding. This auditor report is on the public website for everybody to look at.
It is, public document.
And Tourism Australia at the time responded in full to the auditor's report. So this is a matter fully concluded, 10 years ago now, publicly available for 10 years. So there's not a lack of transparency here or a lack of issues. I mean,
so would you expect then, because we know there's been a huge number of questions in the Senate this week, not many of them have been answered.
Labor's going to jump on this as a smear, right? Absolutely. But everything Karen said there's no allegation of wrongdoing against the Prime Minister or the former Prime Minister in his role. So the point is, the Auditor General and the ANAO regularly examine contracts, agencies, and they regularly find it's very rare that they say a government department or a government body has done an excellent job, there's no problems. They're always looking for deficiencies in public accounting and they quite regularly find them. It doesn't mean that everything is the responsibility
should the Prime Minister,
of the agency.
now that he's Prime Minister and people want to know more about him, should he explain next week in Parliament why he was sacked?
Well, I mean, no, it's like any job that anyone's had over the years. I mean, he's a public figure. He's been in the public life now for 11 years. He's been an immigration minister. He's been a social services minister. He's been the treasurer of the country. He's now the Prime Minister. This report's been available for 10 years. I mean, Mark Dreyfus is about to go, this is the worst thing ever, and we've discovered this big revelation.
Thanks very much, Alex.
He's just about to say that. But this has been public. This has been 10 years. So when did you actually discover this was the worst thing that you've ever discovered, Mark? That's why I'm going to preempt your comments.
It's never been explained. This is the point. There's been a whole lot of kind of obfuscation about why he lost his job. There was a suggestion it was the "Where the bloody hell are you" campaign.
So what? People do good and bad advertising campaigns in agencies across the deck.
Well, that actually was quite a successful campaign.
You can remember it, and Tony even joked about it at the beginning.
It was a successful campaign, so it never made sense that was given as the reason for him being dismissed.
What's the worst allegation you're making?
Well, this report explains things that we hadn't had explained before.
Well, it was fully responded to by
go across into here
publicly.
Whether Mark Dreyfus is going to
this the worst thing you've ever heard in your life?
He's going to use your lines.
In the QC brief.
That's right. Alex didn't get it quite right, unfortunately. The Prime Minister, Mr Morrison, is now in charge of the country. And I think Australians would be very interested to know why he was sacked from being in charge of a considerably smaller outfit, a Commonwealth Government agency called the Tourism Commission, of which he was the Managing Director. He was sacked by a Liberal government, if people can just think about this, by Fran Bailey, who was the Minister at the time. And I think there's a great deal more that Australians should learn now that he is Prime Minister, partly as a result of good numbers work by Alex over here, who converted a failed coup that was meant to put Mr Dutton into the election of Mr Morrison. So he's been Prime Minister for 3 months. That's why there's now interest in this. That's why it's absolutely right for Karen, as an investigative journalist, to be looking into matters in Mr Morrison's past that weren't quite so important when he was the Treasurer, but now that he's in charge of the country are vitally important, and I think Australians want to know more
very
about
briefly,
it.
are people going to see this as a get square for Bill Shorten being dragged before a Royal Commission to answer questions about his past?
Well, just to remind Alex, I didn't raise this, the Labor Party didn't raise this. This is Karen, and I'll give credit for her investigative journalism, although, as has been pointed out, it's in plain sight. There's an audit report.
That was, you know,
but
Google.
It having been written up, I'm pretty interested to know. It's reminded us all that Mr. Morrison, not long before he entered the Parliament, was sacked as the Managing Director of Tourism Australia. So it appears we've now got this failed ad man as Prime Minister. I'm pretty interested to know a bit more about him, and I think Australians probably share that interest.
So do you agree with the point being made that when Parliament resits next week, the House that is, that this is going to be a matter of significant questioning?
Right, so Alex is writing my script here and you're writing my script for next week.
It's a question. It's a question as to whether that's true.
It was raised in the Senate. We had a Senate-only sitting week last week, and there were a number of questions that were put to the government's senior ministers, none of which was answered, and it might well be that we return to this subject next week.
Greg Sheridan.
So look, Tony, I think the first thing I want to say is this was a very good bit of journalism by Karen, and very soberly written and very fairly written, and very enlightening. And I agree with Alex Hawke that there's no suggestion of any criminality or anything. I thought Where the Bloody Hell Are You was a terrific campaign. It's the only one I remember apart from Put a Shrimp on the Barbie. But here is the inescapable problem for the Prime Minister. People take an interest in a Prime Minister in a way they don't in anybody else.
Yes.
And look, the truth is, apparently, he got the sack from the Tourism Commission. Now, I can imagine a million reasons why he doesn't want to go into that, because if he says, look, Fran Bailey was silly to sack me, then she's going to come out and defend her record and everything. But I don't think that the PM can avoid it. I think he'll have to have a line to say, I don't think you can get away with saying it's a long time ago. You know, there are much more grievous allegations, but it didn't work for Julia Gillard talking about, you know, when she left that law firm and so on. And being sacked is not the worst thing in the world, you know, that happens, that's okay. But I do think you've got to own up to it. When you're Prime Minister, you can't run away from any significant
So you talk about Karen's reporting, and one of the things she reported was that Scott Morrison was a member of the Public Accounts Committee.
But he resigned before...
When the audit report was tabled.
But Karen reports that he resigned before it was tabled, or just...
No, he was on the committee, which is the committee that scrutinises these reports. He was on the committee at the time it was tabled.
Did he declare a conflict of interest?
I'm not aware that he did, but I haven't had answers to questions from his office about that.
But he resigned almost the next minute, didn't he?
No, he resigned 6 weeks later. He was appointed to the front bench, and he and one of his colleagues both resigned on the same day. So by the time the reports were dealt with in batches, sort of 6-month batches. So by the time the committee actually dealt with this and a whole lot of other reports and waved this through with a lot of others, he was not on the committee.
My point is that there's almost certainly, I would bet London to a brick, nothing remotely sinister about this. But the PM won't be able to get away with just saying, it was a long time ago, don't ask me about it. He's going to have to have an answer to those questions.
And John Howard was the Prime Minister at the time, and he could theoretically have stepped in and stopped him being sacked, but he didn't. OK, let's move on. The next question is from Julia Kocic.
Recently, the Anglican Diocese of Sydney wrote an open letter to Parliament calling for the maintenance of the right to employ teachers who adhere to the ethos of their schools, and perhaps even a positive right to religious freedom. The letter was met with widespread outrage and protest and framed as discriminatory against LGBT teachers. Is this the beginning of the erosion of religious freedoms in this country?
Alex Hawke, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Look, I thought the letter was important. I think it's important that people in Australia have the right to practice their faith, to organise around schools and churches, and also not be discriminated against for their religious beliefs or practices. So, you know, I have some Anglican schools in my electorate. I know the Anglican school sector well. And I think it was important at the moment that they wrote that letter and communicated some of the challenges that they are facing in 2018. And I think while we don't want to see people of same-sex attraction discriminated against, we also don't want to see people of faith discriminated against. And I think people have the right to practice their faith in their own homes, in their schools and in their communities.
So the recommendation 5 of Philip Ruddock's expert panel says this: the Commonwealth should amend the Sexual Discrimination Act of 1984 to provide that religious schools can discriminate in relation to the employment of staff on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity or relationship status. Now, that is an amendment specifically designed to allow the discrimination against LGBTI teachers, is it not?
It could be framed that way. I mean, I haven't had the opportunity to see that report yet or read it in depth. That's been in the papers, that recommendation. It's an important question to balance these rights. So in Australia, we don't have this challenge at the moment where we have a lot of problems with schools discriminating against students in particular. We don't have the same activism that we see in the US or the same litigious society, but we're starting to see a kind of a push on people of faith. And so I accept that there may be situations or circumstances where schools might need to protect themselves against activists trying to change the essential tenets of the faith that's being taught at the faith-based school.
Mark Dreyfus, this is already in the Act, the 1984 Act brought in by the Hawke government. So that right already exists, doesn't it, for religious schools to discriminate against gay teachers?
There are exemptions in the Sex Discrimination Act which permit, at present, religious schools to discriminate against staff and teachers and also to discriminate against students. And that's been the subject of controversy since the week before the Wentworth by-election, when parts of the Ruddock report were leaked. Alex is in the unfortunate position which is that he came out immediately upon these leaks and said that in his opinion schools should have the right to expel students who are gay. Unfortunately for Alex, the Prime Minister disagrees with him, and the Prime Minister promised before the Wentworth by-election that he would remove the exemption in the Sex Discrimination Act that allows for that discrimination against gay or lesbian students. And we're waiting still for the Prime Minister to do this. So I'm hoping that in the next sitting week, which starts next Monday, we've got a fortnight left of sittings for the year, that we'll be able to do this.
So where's Labor on this? Because as we said, it was a Labor government that brought in this exemption in the first place. I think it was the Gillard government basically kept it in play rather than get rid of it. So,
well, I'm very clear about this. I was the Attorney-General in May 2013 when this was legislated at the time of adding to the Sex Discrimination Act the protected attributes of gender identity and sexual orientation. What we did was to carry through, almost as a consequential amendment, the exemptions that had been there since 1980.
So you kept the exemptions,
we kept them.
Meaning that religious schools could sack
yes,
gay teachers?
Yes.
So are you proposing to keep those if you come into government?
No, because...
So you did the wrong thing back then?
No, it was the right thing back then because the important change that was made in 2013 was the addition of these protected attributes of sexual orientation and gender identity, and carrying through the exemptions was seen as simply a consequential change. What's striking to me is how Australia's changed in the 5 years since 2013, that the leak of the Ruddock report was met with a wave of opposition, of public opposition, so much so that Mr Morrison said, we'll get rid of that exemption at least so far as it relates to students.
Right.
And I'm heartened by that, and we've agreed with the Prime Minister and we're going to work together with the Liberal government.
Susan, do they have any such legislation in the United States which would allow a religious school to not, or to sack or not employ a gay teacher, or even to get rid of a gay student?
Well, first of all, I would say the culture wars are definitely even more vigorously combated, I would say, at this point in the United States. And you're right, in particular, the Supreme Court and our courts have become extremely involved in this. Forget about the level of what religious schools or independent people can do in their own organizations, which is protected, by our First Amendment as well as by legislation. We have had recent Supreme Court cases which might have made their way here to Australia, in which, even the right of bakers to refuse to bake a wedding cake for a gay couple has been upheld in the most recent term of the Supreme Court. So I would say that once you go down this road of the culture wars, there's endless fodder, and unfortunately in our politics, I would say that there's been seen to be benefits in both parties at times in waging these culture wars. But I think Mark's point is very well taken too, though, that the world is changing very quickly. And as you know, we did have the Supreme Court in the United States recognize the right of gay marriage recently, a few terms ago, in a way that reflected, I think, a dramatic social and political change in a very short period of time in the United States. This is now a decision that is widely accepted across the political spectrum in a way that it wouldn't have been only, say, 10 years ago.
Greg, what do you think? Is the change in Australia been so profound that that amendment or that part of the Act should be wiped out, or should it be amended, as Philip Ruddock said, to set it in cement?
Well, Tony, I think the government made a complete balls up by commissioning the Ruddock report and then keeping it secret, begging for it to be leaked to cause the maximum damage to the whole debate in every direction. Now, Tony, cut me off if I'm not allowed to say this, but in a book I recently wrote, called God is Good for You.
Like Greg Sheridan.
Yeah. But I'll retract that if that's out of order. I did suggest
I think it just appeared on the screen under your name.
Oh, God bless the ABC.
You needn't say it again.
No. Well, I think once is enough. I did argue that there is going to be an assault on the freedom of religion, of Christians. Now, I've been associated personally with many Catholic schools and some other Christian schools. There have always been gay teachers, there have always been gay kids. I've never heard of a speck of discrimination. Now, this debate cries out for a little bit of goodwill and common sense. Yep. I think what religious schools want is the ability not to employ people who go out and campaign against their ethos. I cannot imagine any circumstance in which they would discriminate against a student. I can't imagine them not wanting to hire someone who is campaigning against their ethos. Now,
so if someone, for example, were to have campaigned during the recent postal vote for same-sex marriage, do you think that school would have the right to sack that teacher?
Well, I don't even think it's so much a right to sack someone. I think it's hiring someone in the first place. I think once someone is hired, that's why I say there needs to be a certain common sense, and there's a lot of wisdom in tradition. And the way our schools have grown up, there has been, in effect, very little discrimination of that kind. But I don't think if you're... Now, and some schools, all schools will be different. Uniting Church was very happy about gay marriage, so Uniting Church School will be very relaxed about it. If you're a very religious or, very traditional religious group and you've got a particular view of marriage, then you'd ask your teachers not to campaign publicly. I think maybe the plebiscite was a one-off, and I think it was... I disagree with Susan. I think it was much better that it happened in Australia because of the plebiscite. But a point I'd make, which I think is critical, in all the similar jurisdictions to Australia, what you've seen is a slow hydraulic increase of pressure against Christian institutions being allowed to preach their normal teachings. Now, as you know, I advocated a yes vote in this plebiscite, but I don't think it's homophobic for a Christian church to teach the traditional view of marriage, for long as they're not actually making homophobic statements. There was a case in Tasmania that was withdrawn, the famous one against the Archbishop. He was taken to the Anti-Discrimination Commission for extolling that doctrine. There have been cases where church adoption agencies can't operate. I think that is oppressive. I think that is an oppressive arm of liberalism, and it's on the way here.
OK, I'm going to move on because we've got so many other questions. Remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. The next question comes from Lloyd McDonald.
Yes. On Insiders yesterday, Simon Birmingham kept reiterating that a decision on relocating Australia's embassy in Jerusalem would go through due process and Australia's national interest would be the prime consideration. How is it in our national interest to alienate the largest Muslim nation in the world, which is also our closest neighbour, and with whom we do 7 times the amount of trade than we do with Israel?
I'm actually going to start with Susan because Donald Trump was the first one to break with the order of things, if you like, or the convention, and move the US embassy to Jerusalem. Are you surprised, first of all, to see that Australia may follow him?
Well, I imagine that President Trump would be delighted if Australia followed him. One of the things that's been striking about this decision, once it's been taken by the U.S. president, is that, many other countries have not followed behind. And I think that is one of the things that's notable in general about the Trump foreign policy, is that it's a much more unilateral moment in the United States. We've been used to leading with partners and pursuing a much more multilateral course, and would have avoided in the past, actively avoided taking steps that we knew others weren't going to follow, whether it was internationally or at the United Nations, for example. President Trump has shown a real willingness to go it alone, but I imagine he would be eager for others to follow. One point that's important to note is that actually in the United States, both Democrats and Republicans for many years have supported, in principle, the moving of the embassy. And in fact, it was the subject of legislation in the U.S. Congress. The issue was that it was left to the determination of the president when was the right time to do that. And so for many years, basically, they simply certified that conditions weren't right. And the view was that we should wait to do this until it was part of a broader peace settlement. As you know, President Trump has sort of exploded that. He's assigned his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to come up with a peace plan. He once said it was a very easy thing to do. It was really overblown, the idea that the peace process was so hard. Now, of course, it looks much harder. I was just told last week, well, maybe it'll be in 2 or 3 more months that Jared Kushner will unveil this peace plan. Now you have the Netanyahu government looking uncertain again, the prospect of early elections in Israel. So color me skeptical that there will be any major peace process before elections in Israel next year. We'll see what Australia does, but I imagine it would be very welcomed. And I wouldn't be surprised if behind the scenes you're seeing some actual pressure from the Trump administration to this government here in Australia.
Does the US experience suggest that Australia should expect a backlash if it were to do this?
You know, look, one consequence of the Trump administration decision was a refusal on the part of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Abu Mazen, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, has broken off direct conversations and contacts with the Trump administration. Obviously, it's pretty hard to negotiate a final status peace process between Israel and Palestine if you're not even talking to each other. So that is one pretty direct consequence. And again, I would imagine that there would be a similar reaction and view on the part of the Palestinians to that decision if Australia made it.
Mark Dreyfus, Dr. Mahathir from Malaysia said we should expect terrorism if we went ahead and did this, if the Australian government went ahead and did this. That it would be a call to terrorism, I think he said. What do you say? Well,
Dr. Mahathir has said a number of difficult things. He said a number of anti-Semitic things in the past, which I'd condemn. But whatever Dr. Mahathir said is not at the nub of this. I look at this in the same way that Greg Sheridan's senior colleague Paul Kelly looked at it. He described it as a monumental blunder for Morrison to have even suggested, without consulting his foreign minister, without consulting any neighbours, any neighbouring countries, without consulting our security agencies, that he just announced for really quite grubby political reasons of scrounging for a few votes in the Wentworth by-election. And now we watch this government in complete disarray. Today they've fallen to fighting with each other about this decision. I repeat, it's not about anything Dr. Mahathir has said. This is a problem entirely of Mr. Morrison's own making. He's made a decision about a quite difficult piece of foreign policy. And I'd quote Paul Kelly again, who said that this is, on Saturday, a big piece he wrote, that he said this is not in Australia's interest. Foreign policy decisions have to be dictated by what is in Australia's interest. And I have yet to hear anyone articulate why it is in Australia's interest to even consider at this time in a unilateral way moving the embassy.
Let's go to our government representative first, and Alex Hawke. Is it in the national interest of Australia to do this?
Yeah, Lloyd, I think it is. And look, Australia, if you go back to history, we were the first nation to support the UN resolution of petition of Israel. And why did we do that? Because we wanted a home for the Jewish people. We wanted to make sure there was stability in the region. And now we have an emerging democracy that we have good trade with, the only stable democracy in the Middle East. And I think the arguments are quite compelling. I mean, earlier this year you saw Julie Bishop, when she was the Foreign Minister, remove money that was going to the Palestinian Authority because it was not ending up in the right hands. I think that was the right decision. I think our support for Israel and democracies around the world like Israel, and our support of the US and our allies is really important. Israel is the most picked on and badly treated nation at the UN that we've ever seen. There are hundreds of resolutions every year against it. I think we have to stand up for what's right in the international community, and supporting Israel is one of those things. And it's absolutely in our interest to stand up for democracies in the world and other nations that we can get along with, that are compatible with Western values.
Alex, I'm going to just take you to the question. I'll come to Karen in a minute too, but the question was, how's it in our national interest to alienate the largest Muslim nation in the world, which is our closest neighbour?
Well, I don't think it will, and I think there are often theatrics about these issues internationally. I think what's more important is that the Australian government decides what's best for our foreign policy and what's best and what's most consistent with Australian values. Obviously, there's been some commentary about other nations' reactions, but we can't allow other nations to set our foreign policy.
It sounds like you'll be personally disappointed if the Prime Minister steps away from this.
No, we have a process about this, and we have to think of it from all angles. We'll have to have the national security considerations, we'll have to have the foreign policy considerations, our trade considerations. We have to listen respectfully to our trading partners. We have to take everything into account. But ultimately, the Australian government's got to make a decision about what's good for Australia. And there are very good arguments about ensuring that we respect Israel's capital of West Jerusalem, and we support them internationally. And that's what we did at the United Nations recently. And this didn't come about the by-election, as Mark says. There was a vote at the United Nations, a resolution, another resolution.
Nobody believes that.
Well, Mark, you don't have to, but there was a vote at the UN, another one to condemn Israel, and Australia did the right thing there and supported Israel.
Karen Middleton.
Well, I think we are allowing other countries to influence our foreign policy, because the only reason the government talked about doing this is because the United States did it. That's the only reason. And to Lloyd's point, I think the time for considering the national interest was before the Prime Minister was thinking out loud about it. This is why Prime Ministers usually, and Foreign Ministers and Defence Ministers, don't think out loud about foreign and security policy, because what happens is you cause problems with your bilateral relationships. I think the Indonesians were genuinely shocked that this was being mooted publicly. It wasn't even a decision to do it, it was we might do it, which shows that you're not decisive, which if they weren't genuinely shocked, then they can use it as leverage in their relationship anyway, and I think that's probably now happening with both Indonesia and Malaysia. It causes a problem. It's not as simple for Australia to move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem as it was for the United States. They already had diplomatic premises there. They just put a different badge on it. We don't. We have premises in Tel Aviv. It's expensive to buy real estate. It will cost, the estimate is it will cost about $200 million to move. It will cause potentially problems with the peace process. Australia doesn't officially recognise Israel's annexure of East Jerusalem. If we do this, it would be like tacit recognition, which causes potential
that's not true.
Causes potential other
Karen,
problems.
I'll get you to wind up your points so I can actually go to the other side and find out whether Greg's on a unity ticket with Paul Kelly.
Julie Bishop, as I understand it, investigated this when the Americans did do it. The security agency said it was a bad idea. The Foreign Affairs Department said it was a bad idea. They all said it was, and she didn't even put a cabinet submission forward.
Paul Kelly.
I'm the good-looking elder statesman at the Australian.
You're much older.
Paul has a papal and regal bearing. But, Mark, you must have missed my columns on this subject. You quoted Paul's by mistake. Look, there are two issues here. One is the issue in principle and the other is the regional reaction. It's wrong to say it would imply recognition of East Jerusalem.
Well, that's a view.
No, nobody holds that view. Russia in 2017... No, nobody holds that view. Russia in 2017...
Me, so some people...
Yeah, well, they're telling you lies, Karen, because nobody who has even a kindergarten knowledge of this issue holds that view. Russia in 2017 made a statement explicitly recognising West Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And it said, as indeed Scott Morrison said in his first statement, and we envisage East Jerusalem as a capital for a future Palestinian state. We already recognise Israeli sovereignty over West Jerusalem. You know, when Israel declared independence, 6 Arab armies attacked it, tried to destroy it. Israel's territory was established in that war. It included West Jerusalem. In the late 1960s and early 70s, there were more than 20 nations, including the Netherlands, who had embassies in Jerusalem. The fact that Bill Clinton, George W. Bush and Barack Obama for a time supported locating the embassy in Jerusalem, you're not going to tell me they were opposed to a two-state solution or they recognised Israeli annexure of East Jerusalem. They certainly didn't. So in principle, there is in fact no argument against it, and no argument has been made in principle.
But it's the
But
process.
the second question about the regional reaction. You know, I've been watching Indonesia for many decades, and the stupidest thing you can do when an Indonesian minister decides to have a bit of sport with Australia is to have a nervous breakdown. The worst moment that I ever saw an Australian government interact with Indonesia was when Kevin Rudd said, if Tony Abbott turns the boats around, there will be a naval confrontation. The Indonesian Navy will fire on the Australian Navy. There'll be bloodshed at sea. Now, that was incredibly irresponsible and stupid thing for a Prime Minister to say. It was also completely untrue. The Indonesians never moved a single boat 1 inch. But what it says to the Indonesians is, if you guys are respectable nationalists, you're going to react like this. Now, one trade minister, the Indonesian Foreign Ministry, which is notoriously without influence in the Indonesian system, gives a bit of old non-aligned movement, you know, boilerplate jargon. This agreement was ready to be signed when Scott Morrison first went to Indonesia, long before Jerusalem was ever thought of. The Indonesian system has a great capacity not to come to a decision.
Okay, all right.
So, let me finish this sentence.
Well,
let me just finish this sentence. Yep. So, one Indonesian minister has a little bit of sport with Australia. It hardly figures in the Indonesian media. But the Australian opposition and the commentariat go berserk. That then feeds back into the Indonesian system, and we're begging them to give us a smack, and then we'll do as we're told.
I think both Susan wants to get involved, but Susan, go ahead.
Just a minor point there on this issue of West Jerusalem versus East Jerusalem, because that really is at the heart of it. As you correctly point out, the United States, both Democrats and Republicans, supported moving the embassy to West Jerusalem. What the Trump administration has done, however, is something different than that. President Trump deliberately did not make reference to East or West Jerusalem.
Unlike Scott Morrison.
In the recognition of it, and that has changed the contours of the debate in a way that it does strike me as a distant observer. Australia also choosing, and would be the most significant country to do so, would be seen as endorsing the Trump administration's decision, which is different.
But Scott Morrison did make reference to East Jerusalem as a future capital.
All right. Now, Mark Dreyfus,
very quickly.
I know very quickly, but can I just put this to you? If the present government decided to do this and you came into government, would you reverse the decision?
It's entirely hypothetical. I don't believe the government's going to go ahead and do this.
Let's say they did it.
And we would have. It would depend on how long it had happened for, when the election is, whether the establishment had taken place. If it's right, as Karen says, that there's $200 million of expenditure to make it happen, I very much doubt it would have happened by the election. So that's hypothetical. But
if the decision were taken before the election and not much else had happened,
we would have to review it if we win the election and came to government. But can I just say...
So it's a possibility you might actually accept it.
I look forward to a time, and I think many Australians do, of course it's a possibility. I look forward to a time when Australia's able to establish its embassy in West Jerusalem. But it can't be done unilaterally. That's the problem with this.
How else does it get
and
done?
that's why Morrison's made such a mess of
the UN's
this.
Not going
He's going to end up backing down, I predict it. And of course, we would like to see a state of Palestine, but it has to be part of.
Okay.
It can't be unilateral. We can no more unilaterally move the embassy.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to wind it up there
unilaterally move.
In order to get to some of the questions.
Palestine.
And the next question is from Lenny Quagg.
Thanks, Tony. The recent APEC summit failed to deliver a joint communique, mainly due to differences between the two superpowers, US and China. Is it inevitable that Australia must choose between our traditional ally or our largest trading partner?
Karen, I'll start with you.
It's going to be a very difficult choice, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the statistics about the size of the Chinese economy versus the size of the American economy, very soon, within the next couple of decades, we're going to see a shift in power, and Australia will face a difficult choice. And I think maybe ultimately they will have to make a decision. At the moment, they are relying on the Australian government's relying very much on China economically, but absolutely on the United States in terms of the security relationship. But we are seeing increasing tensions, and this was not nothing. This decision not to have a communique. I used to cover APEX for my sins every year, and there was always a communique. It usually got leaked beforehand, and it was often sort of quite banal language, but it was agreed language. And the fact that they can't agree does indicate that we're shifting a gear in this tension between the US and China. And I think Australia's response in the Pacific is much more direct. They're much more directly responding to China's influence financially in the Pacific. That influence has actually been growing. I remember going to the Solomon Islands when Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister, and we were briefed then about the increasing Chinese influence. That's been going for a decade, so we have taken a long time to try and figure out what to do about it, but we are addressing it directly, and the Chinese recognise that, and I think the tension is rising.
OK, I'm going to bring in another question and we can discuss both of them simultaneously with the rest of the panel. It's a question from Johnny Makovsky. Hey, Johnny.
Hi there. Susan, my question's for you as one of Washington's top Trumpologists. Do you think there's any part of Trump that's able to recognise the benefits of America's alliance system beyond mere transaction? Is it possible Trump can look at countries like Australia and Canada or France and think of them as friends with common values rather than foes who are only interested in ripping off America?
Good question. Good question. I would say that if you're looking for President Trump to have any kind of a values-based foreign policy, I wouldn't hold your breath because it might not go so well.
Do you think it's... I mean, just bearing in mind the previous question and Australia having to choose between its interests in China and its long-standing alliance with the United States, does Trump have any bearing on this, or do we look over the horizon and forget about him?
Well, this is the question, as you might imagine, that we debate a lot in Washington these days. And I think an important thing to keep in mind if in your own amateur Trumpology, and we're all Trumpologists now, right? I think an important thing to keep in mind is that there is often a Trump foreign policy and a Trump administration foreign policy, and those are not always the same thing. And interestingly, you could argue that actually getting tough on China is one of the areas of real consensus and where there is a strong overlap between what President Trump's own inclinations seem to be and that of his increasingly hawkish administration and supported by Republicans and a large number of Democrats on Capitol Hill as well. I think there's a sense that our policy toward China, which was integration into global institutions, a sense of building perhaps a network of economic and security partnerships to contain China, has not really succeeded in the way that you might imagine. So you're hearing very Cold War-like rhetoric. I thought it was very significant that China seems to have ratcheted up its response in this recent APEC summit. That's something that we have not seen before. And, you know, again, you even heard from Xi Jinping the language of criticism, indirect, he didn't say his name, of President Trump, but nonetheless unmistakable and very significant criticism of President Trump for being both a unilateralist and a protectionist. That was the words that he used. So I think we're moving toward a period of confrontation. As you know, President Trump often chooses confrontation. He looks at times to escalate rather than to de-escalate. So I think there is a pretty strong argument that Australia will increasingly be placed in an uncomfortable position in a way that it had not been in the past. The other thing I would say that marks a real break in American foreign policy from where we have traditionally been, with both Democrats and Republicans, where President Trump, it seems to me, is most different on foreign policy, is in his view of really the world as much more of a 19th century great powers rivalry type world in which great powers like China, Russia, and the United States not only should sit down and negotiate things amongst each other, but really should be entitled to their own spheres of influence. And you see that in some ways with his attitude toward Russia and its neighbors, not our problem, not our business. And so if I were an American partner here in the Pacific, I would be concerned about that. I don't think it's a majority view in the United States, even in the Republican Party, but it is a radically different view of America and the world.
Greg, what do you think, and how much does Trump complicate the question, the original question, as to what Australia chooses when it comes? I know Australia's done a very fine job, actually, of not choosing, but can that go on forever?
Well, Tony, I was a never Trump conservative. I was like Brett Stevens or William Crystal. I just thought Trump was a gargoyle and hideous beyond imagining. But I actually think he's turned out to be a much better president than I thought he would be. And with Trump, The key is to look at what he does, not what he says.
Yeah.
I'm not saying what he says is unimportant, but what he does is more important. He's raised defence spending. That's very good for us. He's cut corporate tax levels. That's very good. That's a very good move. We've just had a fantastic couple of weeks in Asia. This Lombron naval base on Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. So Papua New Guinea has invited Australia and the United States to jointly work on a joint naval base. Now this is a huge, big development in our strategic outlook and us taking responsibility for our own destiny. This is not a question of us being drawn into something the Americans are doing vis-a-vis China. This is us drawing the Americans into our strategic needs. We had this week a meeting at a very high level of the Quadrilateral Group, US, Japan, India, Australia. The Indians have been very reluctant to have a new meeting of that because they've been worried about our steadfastness. I think Trump scares his enemies, whereas Obama scared no one. The problem is he also scares his friends. But there it is. I mean, nobody's perfect.
Mark Dreyfus?
I was just contemplating Greg's comment that Trump is scaring his friends. I don't agree with Greg's point suggesting that Trump's words don't matter.
No, I didn't say that, Mark.
OK, good, because words are actions too. And I think we have to pay attention to both actions and words. Australia is in the position that China is our biggest trading partner by a long distance over any other country, and that is likely to continue for the foreseeable future. Australia's interests are potentially threatened by a trade war that is being talked about between the United States and China, so that's something to be of concern. And you are all witnessing a recalibration of relationships, including something of a recalibration of the relationship between Australia and China. And I think it's fair to say that there is a large degree of bipartisan agreement between certainly the parties of government here in Australia, Labor and Liberal, about the need for something of a recalibration, certainly the need to state Australian values in our discussions and negotiations with China. And I share the alarm that's been expressed about what just occurred at the APEC conference, that it's the first time that there has been no outcome, no communique at the end of the conference, and some fairly strident positions taken by China, which appear to have played some part in that result of no communique. So we're in a difficult time.
We're running out of that difficult time as well. Alex Hawke.
Look, it's an excellent question, and we are straddling both at the moment, and I think we're doing a fairly good job of it. I mean, when President Trump didn't want to commit to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Australia forged it alone, and we demonstrated that we could commit a serious multilateral trade deal and get it signed, and independent of America and independent of their view about trade in our region. Obviously, APEC, it's disappointing that we didn't have a final communique, but it's an inevitable consequence of the Trump administration's approach on trade. And I don't think we have too much to be afraid of there. America is still our strongest ally and best friend and our long-term economic partner, and we want them involved in the region. And while Susan talks about President Trump and the Trump regime, I was there in the Parliament when President Obama came to our Parliament and reoriented American foreign policy back to the Pacific and back to our region, declaring that our region was the most important region for the next century from America's foreign policy perspective. I think, in a sense, President Trump and his administration, as Susan points out quite rightly, whether hawkish or not, are taking on what they see as trade inequities in our region, and it will continue to be a key focus of the US. That's good for Australia. We can work with both of these partners, we can trade with both, and we can make sure we're part of the bridge there in this part of our region. But the government's made some important announcements about Lombron, as you said, a port, a significant development in Papua New Guinea. We're very interested in the Pacific and making sure that the Pacific is our backyard and that we invest heavily in its growth and development.
Thanks, Alex. Time for one last question. It's from Rob Pham. Hi, Rob.
Hi. With the recent midterm elections in America, I've seen a rise in the number of both American and Australian youth that are leaning towards the ideas of socialism and shouting down a lot of political commentators with opposing opinions. As a Vietnamese migrant son, I've been told secondhand the horrors and failures of a socialist regime. How do you feel about our youth of our nation appealing to such obviously dangerous ideas and advocating them?
Susan, I'll start with you. Did the midterms in the US indicate an upturn in socialism?
Well, look, it was a very strong midterm election year for the Democratic Party, and in fact, it was probably in the end in the House of Representatives the largest victory for Democrats since the Watergate midterms in 1974 amidst the scandal and ultimately exit from office of Richard Nixon. So it's a significant election in our context. I would say it's a misinterpretation to say that it reflects the rise of a new, more socialist Democratic Party. If you actually look at many of the people who won election in many of these House districts, many of them were the more centrist candidate. There was really a much more decentralized campaign that Democrats ran. Interestingly enough, there are lots of people in Washington who said, well, that's an easy campaign, just run against Donald Trump. But actually, the Democrats chose to have a campaign that really was much more district focused, and you didn't see many ads running all around the country saying, basically, this is your chance to vote against Donald Trump. That was the implicit message of many of them. So there are certainly a new generation of much more liberal or even left-wing Democrats who are out there in American politics. As you know, Bernie Sanders' strong performance in the Democratic primaries against Hillary Clinton.
Will this class of 2018 in Congress, will they be regarded as the Bernie Sanders class?
No, see, I don't think so. I think that was one possibility after 2016 that we were looking at. What people are saying about this class is that it's certainly the most diverse class in American political history. You have more women elected to the U.S. Congress than ever before. You have more people from different backgrounds, people of color, in Congress than ever before. So I think it's more about the rise of identity politics in America than it is about an ideological shift far to the left.
Greg Sheridan, what do you think? And you can take that question more broadly, because we can see in the UK that Corbyn has got a lot of young supporters. You could find the same thing happen in Australia potentially with Bill Shorten, although ironically he's from the right wing of the Labor Party.
Bill's a very sound man on national security. On economic policy, I've got my doubts.
Anyway, quick answers we need now.
Yep. Look, fam, fabulous question. Good on you. Good on your dad. Always listen to your dad. That's my advice to my sons. Corbyn and Sanders do represent socialism, and no one who lived through socialism, like your dad, would ever have a bar of it. With this, but I slightly disagree with Susan's characterisation of the election. It was a good year for the Democrats in the House. They lost a net couple of seats in the Senate. That doesn't happen in a wave election. It was a mediocre result in the governor's elections, and it was a mediocre result in the House legislatures. And when you watched Trump and CNN go blow to blow, you think, these guys, they're Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. They're the twin leads of a Broadway musical. They're in the same business. They want ratings. And as long as CNN and the Trump enemies go on like that, he's got a good chance of re-election. So you are seeing the rise of socialism. You're also seeing the rise of right-wing populism. You are seeing the rise of identity politics, which is very ugly. And go to Fam's dad. He's got the good oil.
Mark Dreyfus, how does it reflect on Australia in the coming election?
I'd say to you, Fam, I don't think there's a great deal of risk that socialist views are going to take off here in Australia. I think that Australian politics, at least successful Australian politicians, are resolutely going to conduct their politics in the centre. Compulsory voting takes us there, and rest easy. We're not about to see a rise or a wave of socialist views take over in Australian politics.
Yeah, very briefly, Susan, that is interesting because really, although there was a tremendous amount of interest in these midterm elections, less than 50% of people eligible to vote actually did.
Well, that's right. You have compulsory voting here in Australia, and I have to say, so this was the highest midterm election turnout in the United States since 1904, and guess what? 49% only was the result. So it's a dramatically different system. If you had more Americans exercising their right to vote, we would have a very different politics in the United States than we do today. So you do see hyper-empowered minorities, both of the right and the left, who dominate our politics. One thing I would take issue with, though, is this idea that you've made an equivalence between the media and Donald Trump, or Democratic Party and Donald Trump, because I really have to object to that. That's what Donald Trump wants you to think. And I just think that our role as independent journalists covering and looking underneath the rocks of
Not
government
you, Susan,
without fear
CNN.
of favor. But, you know, no. I have to say, because this has, from the beginning, been a very calculated political tactic by the Trump administration. It was February of 2017, 3 weeks after Donald Trump was inaugurated, that he first used the term enemies of the people to refer to journalists and have characterized them as the opposition party. He has done so for calculated political reasons that have little to do with the practice of journalism. And doing our job does not make us either enemies of the people
a lot of them
or
have
an
gone
opposition
crazy
political
too.
party.
When Brennan and Clapper say he's guilty of treason, they're nuts.
We can't have this side debate. Alex Hawke, the rise of the left. Are you looking out and seeing this sort of upsurge of young leftists about to, and socialists effectively, about to take over the country?
Well, I've always seen it, but I'm a different sort of person. But I have to say, Fam, you're absolutely right.
Always seen it. What have you seen?
Well, you know, I've always been on the right, and I've always worried about socialism, the lessons of history, socialism, communism. It's killed millions of people. And what is disturbing in the West today, we see it in the United States of America, the home of freedom, where socialism is sweeping the country. Bernie Sanders is popular. He gets a lot of votes from young people in particular. In the UK, we see Jeremy Corbyn. A lot of young people have forgotten the lessons of history. And here, I disagree with Mark profoundly. I think socialism's on the rise inside the Labor Party in Australia today. I think we have one of the freest and fairest countries in the world, where we redistribute a lot of income, where we have a high welfare bill, and they say they want to take more and more and more away from retirees, from other people. They say, let's keep endlessly redistributing people's income. They say that half, 47 cents in the dollar isn't high enough at the highest top marginal tax rate. That's the Labor Party of today. And Bill Shorten has tried to copy the language of Corbyn, or tried to emulate the language of Sanders. And it's a very dangerous trend in Australian politics as well. And I think if you get Labor at the next election, you'll have the most left-wing Labor Party you've ever seen.
Karen, is the Saturday paper any indication of the rise of the left?
No, well, I was going to make the point, actually, that if you believe the research, it isn't just socialism. If you believe the research, young Australians are toying with all kinds of forms of non-democratic forms of government. And I think what that tells us is that those of us who are directly engaged in politics in this country have got to do better to advertise the virtues of democracy, because I've talked to young people who just say, why, what's so good about democracy? And that's a worry. And I do think that we, all of us, those in the media who engage with politics, and particularly our political leaders, need to do better to make sure that people can see the value in democracy, because otherwise we will lose it.
That is a good place for us to end. Thank you very much. And we thank Rob Phan for his provocative question to get a really good debate going. Now, that's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Greg Sheridan, Mark Dreyfus, Susan Glasser, Karen Middleton and Alex Hawke. Thank you very much. You can continue the discussion with Q&A Extra on News Radio and Facebook Live, where Tracy Holmes is joined by the Monthly's political editor, Paddy Manning. Now, next Monday on Q&A, we'll have our divided Senate around the table, with Liberal Senator Jim Molan, Labor Senator Doug Cameron, Green Senator Maureen Faruqi, plus the Executive Director of the Centre for Independent Studies, Tom Switzer, and People's panellist Yasmin Poole, who's just returned after attending APEC as an Australian youth delegate. Until next week, good night.